During the month of February, leading up to and following Valentine's Day, which is coming up quick, we're talking about love as it's defined by the Apostle Paul in his first letter to the Corinthians. As I explained last week, we're not talking about romantic love or the kind of love that we have for our friends and our family. We're talking about God's unconditional love, agape love. Last week, we read the first part of 1 Corinthians 13, which, of course, is known as the love chapter. And we saw how Paul described agape love using two positive attributes. Love is patient, love is kind, and then 8 negative attributes. And we covered 4 of those last week. As one of my Des Moines cousins would say, pointy-headed intellectual types call that way of describing something negation. That's one word for it. Another word is apophasis. But it's basically a way of describing what something is by describing what it is not. Okay, so last week we talked about how love is not envious, boastful, arrogant, or rude. Next week, Pastor Brian is going to talk about how love does not insist on its own way. Today, we're going to focus on verse 6, which says, love does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices in the truth. Now, some of you may be breathing a sigh of relief and thinking to yourself, oh, good, this one doesn't apply to me because I don't rejoice in wrongdoing. And that was, I have to admit, that was my first reaction too. I thought to myself, who in the world rejoices in wrongdoing? I mean, there might be a few deviants in the world that do, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized what a slippery slope it is, and how often even the best of us can slide right down it. So I'm going to give you some examples. Okay, one of the things I noticed over the last couple of election cycles, when of course people are at their best, right, is the coarseness of the way that many politicians now talk and act. Okay. Not all of them, but many of them, and it's true for both sides of the aisle. The pointy-headed political scientists call that transgressive behavior, which is the root word of transgression, right? Transgressive behavior, and apparently it's really popular with voters. Really popular. In other words, we like it when our candidate says really cruel things about a political opponent. We love it when they use profanity in their speeches. We smile, we join right in, right? In the last election, I saw people who I know would never say a curse word in real life, in normal life. I saw them wearing t-shirts and posting things on Facebook that used extreme profanity. Extreme profanity. Stuff they would never do in real life. By the way, that's rejoicing in wrongdoing, whether you want to admit it or not. The truth is, as human beings, we're attracted to dark things. We are, whether we admit it or not. The people who report on the news know that better than anyone. Have you ever heard this phrase? If it bleeds, it leads. Right? Violence and scandal sell. It's why 90% of news coverage is so distressing. I guarantee if you're watching news all the time, you're freaked out all the time. Guarantee it. And it doesn't matter what network you tune into because they all do it. It's not that love and kindness don't exist. It's just that nobody's paying attention to that. Not really. The people who produce movies and TV shows, they figured that out a long time ago too. We love to watch dramas about people doing bad things. That's what our entertainment mostly consists of. And for most of us, there's nothing more satisfying than seeing a villain get their comeuppance. Right? Now, the Bible teaches that Jesus came into the world to save sinners. We know that. God loved the world so much, He sent His Son not to condemn the world, but to redeem the world, to save it. But unfortunately, many of us either didn't get that memo or else we've forgotten God's primary objective. Because when it comes to evil, at least in the stories, our favorite stories, our preference is to see the villains get themselves just wiped out, right? Heads lopped off, whatever, pushed off a building. That's the stuff we love. I remember a few years ago, everybody was watching HBO's Game of Thrones. Do we have any Game of Thrones fans in the house? I know we do. Anyway, there were a lot of evil characters in that, most of the characters in that, in fact, but there was one who was especially slimy, all right? His name was King Joffrey. Remember him? Ugh. He was the boy king who was so immature, so cruel, it was unreal. So he was poisoned to death at his wedding reception, okay, by his future mother-in-law, and I loved it. This is the scene where he's just starting to realize he's about to die. At the time, I remember saying, that couldn't have happened to a nicer guy. And the whole world celebrated with me. Why? Because that's who we are. And it's not just about villains on TV either. The Germans have a word for the pleasure we experience at someone else's pain, suffering, and failure. It's called Schadenfreude. Okay? Now, you may be thinking, once again, I would never feel pleasure at someone else's pain, ever. And if that's true for you, good for you. Keep it up. But there are lots of people who do. In fact, there's a show that comes on TV every night after the 6 o'clock news. I have to turn the channel anymore. I can't take it. It's called Entertainment Tonight. And as I was working on my sermon this week, it occurred to me why that show bothers me so much. Because it could also be called Schadenfreude Tonight. It really could. Because that's what it is. If you want to hear about the latest beef between A-list actors or B-list actors, or who's taking who to court, or who's having a mental breakdown, or who's addicted to drugs and alcohol, or getting a divorce, or whatever, then tune in. Because that's what you're going to hear. But be warned, if that's what you're consuming on a regular basis, all the time, you're rejoicing in wrongdoing. That's another way to describe it, and love doesn't do that. It also hits closer to home than just watching a TV show. I'd have to say that probably the most common form of rejoicing in wrongdoing is gossip. Sometimes we do it in the church, at least. We do it under the cover of sharing prayer concerns, but there is a fine line, and we have to be careful. Like it says in the book of Proverbs, the words of a gossip are like choice morsels. They go down to a man's inmost parts. In other words, they taste good. We love it when somebody spills the tea. Whether we want to admit it or not, it's fun to talk about the moral failures, the suffering of other people. And of course, we want to put as good a spin on that as possible, but gossip is destructive, and love doesn't do that. Eleanor Roosevelt once said, "Great minds discuss ideas. Average minds discuss events. Small minds discuss people." Great quote. So don't be small-minded. Don't rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoice in the truth. And you might remember Jesus said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." Those who rejoice in the truth talk about God. They point to Jesus. They do things that affirm life and love and the good things in the world. The Apostle Paul knew that better than anyone. That really is the whole point of his letter to the Corinthian church. They were having trouble loving each other in healthy ways. That's what the 12 chapters before 13 are all about. And they weren't the only church to have that problem. Another one of my favorite verses comes from one of Paul's letters in chapter 4 of Philippians. Paul addresses the whole church, but he calls out two particular women in that congregation who were feuding with each other. Calls them out by name. I'd like to be remembered like that forever. Anyway, he said, "I urge Euodia and I urge Syntyche to be of the same mind in the Lord." And then basically, he gives that responsibility of making sure these two feuding women get their act together and be reconciled. That's what he does. He gives that responsibility to the church. But then he says something similar to what we just read in 1 Corinthians 13, about rejoicing in the truth. He said, finally, beloved, whatever is true, there it is, again, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is pleasing, whatever is commendable, if there is any excellence and if there is anything worthy of praise, think about these things. Where we focus our attention matters. It does. Kind of like a vulture flying over the landscape. If we're always on the lookout for rottenness and corruption, guess what we're going to find? When we look for that which is true, honorable, just, and pure, that's what we're going to see. As Paul said, love does not rejoice in wrongdoing. It doesn't spend all of its time focused on that. Instead, it rejoices in the truth. Now, that doesn't mean that we live in denial or that we ignore the evil and injustice in the world and all around us. It just means we keep our hearts and minds in as good a place as possible. Jesus said to his disciples that they should be as wise as serpents and innocent as doves because he was sending them out as sheep into the midst of wolves. Not to be destroyed, though. He didn't want them to be destroyed. In other words, don't hide your head in the sand. Don't be naive about what's going on in the world. You need to understand what the world's all about and how evil operates. But at the same time, you make sure that your motives are pure. Make sure you're being guided, not by selfishness, not by hate, but by love. That's the goal, to be centered in the truth. But it's not easy. That slippery slope is always there. And once you've begun to slide even a little bit, the damage can be bad. There can be repercussions. I'm going to tell you a story about something that happened to me. It's been about 30 years ago now. I was a brand spanking new senior pastor of a church, and there was a couple of key leaders in this church who were feuding with each other, kind of like Euodia and Syntyche in Philippi. And I got caught in the middle of that, unfortunately. I don't even remember all the details. I think it had something to do with the nominating committee, and one of the two fudged the truth about the number of years they'd served in that position, I think so they could serve another year or something along those lines. And I knew they'd done that, but I kind of went along with it because I was green and I didn't want to cause any more drama than was necessary, and it didn't seem like that big a deal at the time. But boy, did it come back to bite me, big time. When the truth came out, I met with the elders, I confessed, I explained what happened, I apologized. I didn't set out to lie or rejoice in wrongdoing, but I wound up supporting it by my silence. And it could have easily derailed my career at that point. What I learned from that mess is that I want to be standing as squarely in the truth as possible because it's the only safe place to be. It really is. You adopt a lie, you slide down that slope. Good luck. And even more importantly, I want God's love to be the primary guiding force in my life because truth without love can be cruel, can be used to hurt people. And love without truth is powerless. It just rolls over and lets evil do its thing. Maybe you've heard the term tough love before. I use this with people all the time. It's what happens when truth and unconditional love team up. So just as an example, in family, sometimes tough love means telling the truth about someone who is engaged in self-destructive behavior and then stopping doing whatever is enabling that behavior on your part. The reason we call that tough love is because it doesn't always feel loving to do that, to create boundaries, right? Or to detach from that. Love does not rejoice in wrongdoing. It also doesn't enable it, or tries really hard not to. Real love tells the truth, even when it's uncomfortable. It resists evil. It resists lies, wherever they may show up. And as I said last week, it's the only thing that has the power to change the world. The only thing. When I told our choir director, Debbie Spears, about our theme for this month, that we were going to be talking about love, right away there was a song that started going through her mind from the early 1970s. And immediately upon telling me this song, it's been going through my mind. It's an earworm. And I'm sure as soon as I give you the song, it's going to be, for those of you of a certain age, it's going to be an earworm for you too. So it describes a love that's not passive, but active. It describes a love that wants to bring peace and unity to the world, and it goes like this. It became a Coke commercial, but it started off as a radio song. I'd like to build the world a home and furnish it with love, grow apple trees and honeybees and snow-white turtle doves. I'd like to teach the world to sing in perfect harmony. I'd like to hold it in my arms and keep it company. I'd like to see the world for once all standing hand in hand and hear them echo through the hills for peace throughout the land. And that was actually the anthem that our choir sang today at the 9 o'clock service. Love works to promote peace and harmony in the world. Just like Paul said to the church in Philippi, make sure those two gets their heads together, get on the same page, right? It teaches others to do the same, to be reconcilers, to be peacemakers. In fact, love looks a lot like the life and ministry of Jesus. In him, we see what love looks like in action. Jesus touched lepers. He hung out with tax collectors and prostitutes. He didn't shame them or condemn them or destroy them. He offered them a path to wholeness and redemption, forgiveness. In one case, he even extended grace and mercy to a woman caught in the act of adultery. Remember that story? Now, you might remember, there was no doubt about that woman's transgression. She was caught in the act, and she didn't try to deny it either. In fact, the religious leaders who were there to stone her to death, they were so certain of her guilt and their own self-righteousness that they were ready to kill her really on the spot, to stone her to death. Now, Jesus could have piled on, right? He could have shown how tough he was on sin. But instead, he put himself in between her and those religious leaders, and he said, whoever is without sin, throw the first stone. And then he gave everyone a really good long moment to let that sink in. That's what he did. Remember, it says in the story, he got down, he wrote on the ground. He's just letting that sink in. And when they wandered off, Jesus turned to the woman and he said, has no one condemned you? Neither do I. Now go your way, and from now on, don't sin again. Jesus didn't wink at wrongdoing and sin. He didn't celebrate and support the transgressions of the people around him, even, especially the people he liked, which is what we tend to do. He told the woman to stop, and he meant it. He meant it. He also made it clear that those self-righteous Pharisees had issues of their own that they needed to fix. And so do we. That's the truth. And that's what Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 13 we are called to rejoice in, because that's what love does. Love rejoices in the truth. May we then go and do likewise.